Well, good evening. I'm Henry Brink. I'm a senior at Hillsdale College. I'm an English major, and I am most recently from St. Paul, Minnesota. And it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Nathaniel Philbrick this evening. Nathaniel Philbrick is an author and a research fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association. He earned his BA from Brown University and his MA from Duke University. Mr. Philbrick is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Samuel Eliot Morison Award from the U.S.S. Constitution Museum, the William Bradford Award from the Pilgrim Society, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the New England Historic Genealogical Society. He's the author of numerous books, including In the Heart of the Sea, which won a National Book Award for nonfiction and was the basis of the 2015 movie of the same name, The Last Stand, Custer, Sitting Bull, and the Battle of Little Bighorn, and most recently, In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. So would you please help me in welcoming Mr. Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you. It is a great delight to be here. Last time I was here, I was speaking about George Armstrong Custer. So we're now going to change venues a little bit and go with George Washington. And I have to say, it was after finishing The Last Stand, my book about Custer, that I was searching for topics. And most of my books tend to focus on communities of people, whether it's the 20 crew members of the whale ship Essex that have just been rammed by a whale and thrown into a survival situation, or 102 pilgrims about to find themselves on a coast about which they know nothing in the fall of 1620, or Custer's regiment bound for the Little Bighorn, where there is a Lakota village of unimaginable size. I'm interested in what happens to communities under terrific stress. And I live on Nantucket Island. It's a community with a year-round population of about 15,000. And our daughter, I was a stay-at-home dad growing up. And we lived briefly in historic Boston, the historic core, which is the North End. And I remember pushing the stroller through the North End of Boston, imagining what Boston was like in the time of the Revolution. And Boston now looks entirely different from what it did then. Back then, it was a 1.1 square mile island dominated by 3 hills of almost mountainous size. With a population of 15,000, connected by a thin neck of land to the mainland at Roxbury. And I began to think, after moving to Nantucket, 15,000. I know what it's like to live in a community of 15,000. You go to the grocery store, you don't know everyone by name, but you recognize them. It's a personal way. When you get to a stop sign and someone blows you off, you don't say anything because that could be your kid's teacher. Or your dental hygienist, which is really, you don't want to. Anyway, so it's a personal way of looking at things. And so, what would have been like to be in Boston as the pressures of a revolution mounted? And so that led to my writing Bunker Hill, and that battle is the obvious sort of plot point that everything leads to. But I found myself unexpectedly taken with a gentleman who arrives just a few weeks later, George Washington. Now, I had grown up with George Washington like all of us do, with George staring at me from the $1 bill. And, this is the guy of a statue. I at that point thought, what could be more boring than George Washington? But the George Washington I was introduced to in Boston in the summer of 1775 was anything but boring, and very different from what he would become, the defensive-minded general that would hold a nation together. He was wild-eyed. He was a lot like George Custer. This was George in his early 40s, red-haired. He didn't like the New Englanders he had inherited in the provincial army. New England has a tradition, we have it on Nantucket, the tradition of the town meeting. And this is democracy at its bare-knuckle best, where you have a town meeting and you basically fight it out on the town floor, and somehow you come to a decision. So these were young men who had grown up in these kinds of situations where they always had a say in what was happening to them. And so when Washington would deliver them an order, they would say, whoa, wait a minute. If we decide we want to do this, we will be very happy to fulfill your order. And this just drove Washington crazy. He was used to a hierarchical society. And so Washington saw this group of militiamen and just wanted to get it over with. Here, the British were in Boston. They were besieged by the provincial army. And this was a group of professional soldiers. He had these militiamen, no money, not enough gunpowder. There was no way he could see fighting a long war. He wanted to get it over with. He wanted to attack Boston, take it by storm, burn it down if necessary, and just get this thing over with. 3 times he would bring that proposal to his Council of War. 3 times it would be voted down unanimously. And ultimately, they would go with a much more conservative plan of bringing his young, soon-to-be head of artillery, Henry Knox, the bookseller who had learned everything he knew about the military through those books, God bless booksellers, and would bring down the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. A few of them would then end up on Dorchester Heights, giving them a commanding view over Boston. And General Howe, who was then the head of leading the British Army, realized we got to get out of here. And thus would come the evacuation of Boston in March of that year. And I just had to follow George. How would he become the Washington who would be capable of holding the country together through 8 years of war and establishing the presidency? How would he? That led me to my next book about the Revolution, Valiant Ambition, in which I paired Washington with Benedict Arnold. People of different arcs. The book begins in summer of 1776. By now, the British have left Boston, but the empire is about to strike back. And it's New York, which is in their sights. And a huge fleet arrives in New York. Ultimately 40,000 soldiers and sailors and a fleet of 400 vessels. This is more people than in all of Philadelphia, the largest urban center in North America at that time. And there is Washington, dug into New York and the high ground in Brooklyn. He's completely outgeneraled in what will be called the Battle of Long Island. But what he is brilliant at is retreats, which he'll be doing a lot of in the years ahead. The nighttime retreat across the East River is one of the more amazing logistical feats in which he delivers his army to the island of Manhattan under the noses of the British, who are completely unaware that this is happening. He then is forced to retreat all the way to ultimately across New Jersey to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, and it's really bad. He's lost most of his army to desertion, and then will come the famous Battle of Trenton, in which he turns it around on Christmas Day, and which is an incredible feat. And it's Washington at his best. It's Washington at the lowest. What Washington had an ability to do is Washington had and I speak of him, he had a true genius. He wasn't a genius like, let's say, founding fathers Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton. He was not a jittery, brilliant person, eloquent and a mind that could go anywhere. He had the ability to dial out the static of life. And believe me, as Washington retreated across New Jersey to the other side of the Delaware River, there was a lot of static out there, a lot of people, a lot of naysayers. You know, he had the ability to just say, okay, what is the most important thing for me to do now? And so there in the Delaware, he realized we've got to have some kind of comeback strategy here. If we're going to do it, we have to shock them. It's the only way we can turn this around. He succeeds in doing that. It's one of the most amazing comebacks in military history. But but what I began to realize with Washington, his genius was also, and primarily so, political. He was very good at working with others, listening to different sides, subtly moving people in directions that, from his point of view, were the right way to go. And when it came to fighting this revolution, he had to deal with Congress. This was, we were creating a republic. And the great danger when it came to revolutions and republics, that all of them would end with a military coup. The civil government in the wake of a revolution is inefficient, frustrating. The military, whether it's Caesar, whether it's Cromwell in England, or in the future Napoleon, someone takes control and the dream ends. And this is what Continental Congress was fearful of. So they kept Washington on a very tight leash. And one of the paradoxes is that the more successful Washington got, the more untrustworthy congressmen became, particularly those in the South, where those in New England, where the revolution had begun. And then following year would come the Battle of Saratoga, in which largely through the heroics of Benedict Arnold, America would score a great victory with Horatio Gates as the commanding officer. Meanwhile, Washington lost a series of battles, the Battle of Brandywine and Germantown, allowing the British William Howe to move into Philadelphia. This got the politicians to wondering whether Washington was the right person. His army is dug into Valley Forge, that terrible winter, and there is an attempt to replace Washington with Horatio Gates. It's unsuccessful, largely because of Washington's political brilliance. He was one of these people. He was not necessarily the greatest military strategist in the world, but he was terrific at working with people, at seeing the big side of things, and his integrity was never doubted. He succeeds in getting through that terrible winter at Valley Forge, and from then on, particularly with a stellar performance, the Battle of Monmouth, he's in. It's, he is the unquestioned face of not only the Continental Army, but he is becoming the face of America, and absolutely essential to all this. One of his best generals, Benedict Arnold, moves in the other direction. He is denied a promotion by the Continental Congress, which were the ones doling out the promotions to Major General. He ultimately decides that while Washington's destiny to hold the country together, it's his destiny to try to tear that country apart. And he unsuccessfully attempts to surrender West Point, where there are 3,000 soldiers and all sorts of armaments and ammunition. He attempts to surrender that to the British. That happens in the late summer of 1780. That is foiled, but America is at an absolute low point. We Americans went into this revolution because we did not want to pay taxes to Great Britain. We apparently did not want to pay the taxes required to support Washington's army. It was withering on the vine. Recruitment levels in the States were miserable. There just was nothing going on. But there was good news. In 1778, after that great victory at Saratoga, France had decided to enter the revolution on our side. And this is terrific because France had what the American army did not have, an effective navy. Up until this point, Great Britain's navy, the most powerful in the world, had a stranglehold on the eastern seaboard. They could move troops at will by sea with relatively lightning speed, enabling them to take Charleston, to move up and down. Washington knew the only way that they had a shot at a victory that would potentially end this thing in a favorable way was with the help of the French Navy. Now, previously, France had been humiliated by the British in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. They had lost Canada. Their ally Spain had lost Florida, New Orleans. But after that, France had launched into a program that they called revenge. And they realized, how are we going to regain the status we had before the 7 Years' War? And that was by retooling their navy. They created a naval academy at Brest, which still exists. A professor there was hugely helpful to me in writing my book, In the Hurricane's Eye. They analyzed naval warfare analytically, applying the ideals of that time to analyze what was going on, and came up with tactical guides that were way beyond anything the British had. In fact, the British were using those guides to help develop their own tactics. They also were retooling their navy, building better ships than the British had. By this time, it had been developed that the best ship of the line, and it was called a ship of the line because the way two fleets would attack each other was they create a line of battle, and the two fleets would come to within firing distance, sometimes only a pistol shot away, and blast away at each other until one side began to give way. And it was realized that a 74, this is a ship with 74 guns, was the optimal size for a ship of the line. And these were, I think we have a tendency to think of square-rigged ships as kind of quaint forms of transportation from the past, but a 74 was the most sophisticated technological creation of the 18th century. Between 500 and 750 men aboard. It took 2,000 oak trees to build one. That's 73 acres of forest. If one of these sailed into a harbor on the American coast, they would take over because they had as many cannons as Washington's army at the beginning of the army. And so Washington needed the French Navy. And this is where his genius comes in. As soon as France entered, he realized what he needed more than anything else was for France to establish naval superiority somewhere on the Atlantic coast where he could coordinate with his army and win that victory that would end the war. But he quickly realized this was going to be difficult, because what had happened with the entry of France and then their ally Spain was that a colonial rebellion became a world war. So now you had England fighting France and Spain. The war moved on into as far as India, but the real center of wealth in the world at this time was the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands of the West Indies. Jamaica, French Haiti, for the Spaniards it was Cuba. Most of their income was coming from these islands. And so once France and Spain enter the war, the ships come in, but they all go down to the Caribbean and fight it out, trading islands back and forth, much to the frustration of Washington, who's stuck outside New York, where now General Sir Henry Clinton is dug in with 10,000 soldiers. Washington is on the Hudson, sort of glaring at him. For 2 years, the war has basically turned, in the Northeast, has turned into a stalemate. Washington complains in a letter, "This war drags on like a cart with no wheels." What is positively happening is what is happening is in the South, and it's not good for America. The British take Charleston, and then Lord Cornwallis meets the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, at Camden, South Carolina. And Horatio Gates is completely annihilated. He literally runs from the battlefield, and the American army is scattered. Washington decides to send the general who has become really his most trustworthy general, Nathaniel Greene, raised a Quaker in Rhode Island on Nantucket. We love our Quakers with a vengeance. And Greene would make his way south. So that was happening. But what Washington desperately wanted was finally to get something happening with the Navy. And then, in the fall of 1780, this is almost a year precisely before what would be the victory at Yorktown, something happens in the Caribbean. 3 hurricanes in the span of a month. The first hurricane would destroy much of Cuba and Jamaica and a good portion of the fleets of both France and England, and along with Spain. But it would be the second hurricane is now known as the Great Storm of 1780. Winds that have been estimated had to be 200 miles an hour because what happened was the trees on these islands were power washed of their bark, just stripped. Every structure annihilated. 22,000 people would die in the Caribbean in that one storm. And then, just a few weeks later, as the Spanish Navy has just departed Cuba with 5,000 soldiers, a fleet of 40 ships, what's known as Solano's hurricane hits. That's the admiral in charge of the Spanish fleet, wipes out that fleet, and the wreckage is forced to flee back to Cuba before they can attack British-held Pensacola, because that's Spain's real goal. And then this is the message that gets delivered to France for the first time. They realize next summer and fall, we don't want to leave our fleet in the Caribbean. We've got to move them north. We have to do as Washington's requesting and come north. This is the beginning of the year of Yorktown, and it starts with a hurricane. Next thing that happens is Benedict Arnold, Britain's newest brigadier general, is sent by Clinton to the Chesapeake. Benedict Arnold quickly proves he might be the best general on both sides. He speeds up the James River, soon has the wartime capital of Richmond, which had been moved that far inland under the assumption that it would be too far away for an enemy to attack. Benedict Arnold strikes with lightning speed. Governor Thomas Jefferson is forced to flee. It's in flames. This obviously angers Washington, who sends down the young French general who's become a kind of surrogate son, Lafayette, to do battle as best he can with Benedict Arnold. In the meantime, Nathaniel Greene has been doing everything he can to consolidate his army, and he and Lord Cornwallis have it out after what's known as the Race to the Dan across the breadth of North Carolina. At that point, Greene doesn't have the soldiers to face the 2,000 crack troops under Lord Cornwallis. He gets over the Virginia border, is able to swell his army with militiamen, dives back south, and they meet in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Greene does not win because Lord Cornwallis has the field at the end, but he has eviscerated Cornwallis's army. That's lost half their best officers and men. Cornwallis retreats to Wilmington to refit, retool, but being someone who is aggressive, he decides rather than retreat to Charleston and consolidate the forces in South Carolina to move into Virginia, where he replaces Benedict Arnold, and he and Lafayette battle it out in a fascinating cat and mouse game. Meanwhile, Washington is in talks with French General Rochambeau, who is stationed in Newport with 5,000 soldiers. Washington is desperate for news about where is the French Navy. Are you going to help me? Unfortunately, Rochambeau has been instructed by France not to inform Washington of the whereabouts of the French Navy. Their fear is that the American war effort is about to collapse. They realize that recruitment levels are not happening. It looks like it's all just going to fall apart. And in case that happens, the fleet that leaves Brest that winter under Admiral de Grasse has been instructed to then sail to Newport, evacuate Rochambeau's army, and abandon North America. Can you imagine if that happened? So they don't want Washington to know quite where de Grasse is. Washington and Rochambeau have a meeting in Wethersfield, Connecticut, to discuss strategy. Washington feels what they should do is attack the British dug into New York. It's the only place where there are enough soldiers where there could be a victory big enough to end the war. The French, however, are fearful of entering New York Harbor. They like the Chesapeake. Rochambeau tells George Washington, okay, we'll do what you say, because Washington is the nominal head of the Allied force, but secretly informs Admiral de Grasse, who by this time has left Brest and is in the Caribbean, that when you come north, you should go to the Chesapeake. It's not until June that Washington reads in the newspaper of de Grasse's activities in the West Indies. He confronts Rochambeau. So what's going on here? Oh, yes, we've been in talking. Don't worry, things will work out. It's August 14th when Washington, by this time Rochambeau's army has moved from Newport to New York, combined with Washington's army on the Hudson. Washington gets a letter from de Grasse informing him that de Grasse is sailing not for New York, as he thought was agreed upon, but for the Chesapeake. There's two congressional delegates who are there with Washington when he gets this letter. Apparently he was very angry. They go to prepare for breakfast. They meet up with him for breakfast, and he's completely calmed down. And this is Washington. He, today we try to fulfill our destinies as a personality. What is our inner core? Let's become that. Washington knew his inner core. His inner core was that of someone with anger management issues, and he spent his whole life trying to control that anger management. He very famously studied the rules of civility. He was under incredible amounts of self-control, but every now and then he just couldn't take it anymore. He would vent it, but then always subsume those emotions to do the best thing for his country. He calms down and he says to the congressional delegates, well, the plan has changed. We are now going to march from New York 500 miles to Williamsburg. And his New Englanders do not want to march in August into the killing heat of the South. He says, we're going to need help. Do your best to help us. And then this is Washington at his best. He's in a situation he didn't want to be in, but he's going to do the best to make it work. And this is where he enlisted the same skills he showed during that retreat across the East River. He does an amazing job of fooling General Clinton in New York, convincing him that the Allied forces are going to attack New York via Staten Island. Letters are leaked, are supposedly stolen that Clinton gets that reinforce all this. Washington's not even telling Rochambeau everything he's thinking of doing because he knows secrecy is paramount. They begin to march the soldiers, and by this time, one of the reasons Washington did not want to attack the Chesapeake was that Lord Cornwallis was moving around the Virginia. He wasn't staying in any one place. And if a large Allied force moved down there, he would just move into South Carolina and escape. And in August, that's what they all assumed Cornwallis would do. Once it became obvious that they were headed down, he'd just move into North Carolina and eventually South Carolina, and he would escape. But for reasons that are still not clear, by this time Cornwallis has dug into a town at the end of the point formed by the James and York rivers, Yorktown. He's digging in to form a potential naval base. Suddenly, there he is, 7,000 British and German soldiers. That's a big army. Things are beginning to fall into place. As Washington would later write, it hit him like a ray of light. If I can get this army down there in time, we just might pull it off. But he had to get the French Navy there. He had to get de Grasse. They cross the Hudson, all the time thinking Clinton is going to attack them. Clinton's convinced they're going to attack them via Staten Island. They march towards Staten Island, and then they veer to the south and head for Philadelphia as fast as they can. They're in Philadelphia when Clinton realizes, whoa, they're not going after me, they're going after Cornwallis. Washington has still heard no news from de Grasse. Where is he? By this time, he should be in the Chesapeake. He's made his way to Elkton, Head of Elk, they called it, at the northern tip of the Chesapeake, where they're going to begin transporting a good portion of the two armies by boats down the Chesapeake towards Yorktown. He still has heard nothing from de Grasse. A messenger approaches with with an express. De Grasse has sailed into the Chesapeake with 28 ships of the line. It's happened. This has happened. It's there. Washington is so ecstatic, he turns his horse around, rides as fast as he can to Chester, Pennsylvania. If you go there now, there's a gambling casino. It's where William Penn first stopped on his arrival to what would become Pennsylvania. But because he knows Rochambeau and his entourage has been sailing down the Delaware, inspecting forts along the way. The French are approaching the dock at Chester, and they see someone, a tall man, in regimentals, with a hat in one hand, a handkerchief in the other, jumping up and down and going like this. And they say, who could that be? It couldn't be Washington. He'd never do anything. It's George Washington. He is so excited that finally this plan that no one could have ever really put together is happening. Rochambeau disembarks, they hug, and Washington was not a hugger. They move on. It's now a race. We've got to get down there as quickly as possible. They make it to Mount Vernon. Washington has not been home in 6 years. 4 grandchildren have been born while he's been away. Can you imagine the emotions of that? They spread out the maps on the dining room table, strategize. They leave. They're just a little ways down the road when Washington gets another message. A large British naval force has just approached the Chesapeake. The French have sailed out. This was 4 days ago, and nothing has been heard from them since. Now, in the history of naval warfare, if 2 comparable fleets of French and British met, the British always won. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about the Battle of the Chesapeake, because that's why you have to buy the book. But I will say, it has been rightfully called the most important naval battle in the history of the world in terms of its ultimate consequences. Because for the first and last time, that's an exaggeration, the French would win. They would force Admiral Graves to sail back to New York for repairs. De Grasse returns to the Chesapeake just as Washington and Rochambeau are arriving. They meet on De Grasse's flagship as the armies come down, and the trap closes around Lord Cornwallis, who's been assured by Clinton in New York that, don't worry, we're going to save you. Thus begins the siege of Yorktown. The French have, I think this is Rochambeau's 17th siege. I mean, these were very common in European warfare. And so the French are very good at this, and it's mid-October when Lord Cornwallis is forced to surrender, thus delivering the victory that Washington had foreseen in his quest for naval superiority. Now, so many times in working on this book and studying Washington, I wanted there to be the time where he could go, yes, I finally did it. But within days of this great victory, his stepson, Jackie Custis, would die of camp fever. This meant that as the country was celebrating, he and Martha were in Mount Vernon in mourning. They would eventually make their way to Philadelphia and then back to the outskirts of New York. It would take 2.5 years to negotiate the treaty that would finally end this war. And it was really in the spring of 1783 that Washington would meet his greatest challenge, I think, as general, and it would not be in warfare. By this time, his army was in Newburgh, New York. The men hadn't been paid for years. His officers, up until then, there had been mutinies, but the officers had always been in line with Washington and controlled things. Now the officers were the ones that wanted some assurance that they would be compensated for sacrificing their lives for all of this time. But we barely had a government. The Continental Congress was a government in name only, a window dressing of a government. They didn't have the ability to tax the American people directly. There just wasn't going wasn't going to happen. The officers put together a proposal that they should march on Philadelphia and demand that the Continental Congress fulfill their wishes. This would have been the military coup that would have destroyed the Republican experiment of the United States. Washington calls his men together and delivers a speech to his officers. They listen to it and are unmoved. By this time, Washington has just turned 50, and like many people turning 50, he's beginning to have trouble reading. And he's just gotten his first pair of reading glasses, but no one has seen him wearing them. He delivers this speech, no one's excited about it, and then he says, well, I want to read this letter from a congressional delegate that is sympathetic to your cause. And he takes out the letter, and he clearly is having trouble to read, and then he says, excuse me, I have not only gone gray in the service of my country, I am going blind. He puts on those glasses and begins to read, and there is not a dry eye in the house. He leaves soon after. The men unanimously agree to do whatever George Washington wants them to do. Washington saved America in that instance. Finally, in November of 1783, the British evacuate New York. Washington has determined that he will surrender his military commission to Congress. When George III hears that this is Washington's intention, he says that if Washington does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And that's what Washington did. He had to go to Annapolis because Congress had moved from Philadelphia to Annapolis because they were fearful their own army was going to attack them. So they had moved to Annapolis. It just shows you. I mean, and then it took them 2 weeks to get a quorum before Washington could surrender his commission. He does that. He was so overwhelmed with emotion that he had to hold his shaking right hand with his left while he delivered his speech. He then made his way to Mount Vernon and arrived at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 1783. Now, I finished In the Hurricane's Eye on Christmas Eve. It was a very different kind of Christmas for me. And I have to tell you, I grew up thinking that the American Revolution was a series of battles leading to inevitable American victory, they were a series of stepping stones. It wasn't like that at all. By the fall of 1780, everything was up in the air. And as Washington watched, it was a series of seemingly random events under no one's specific control that had to fall into place for it all to work. And as he would say in a letter, if you do not believe in God, look what happened in America in that year. And so I think the hurricane is the appropriate metaphor for this war. And, it was this series of, events circling around that could have gone anywhere, but always there was Washington, holding it together in the hurricane's eye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now have time for Q&A. Please make your way to the microphone if you have a question. Also, Mr. Philbrick will be signing a copy of his book, In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown, out in the Searle Center directly following the lecture.
Thank you. My wife says that I'm naughty and I shouldn't ask this question, but I have children in the Naperville High School, or grandchildren in Naperville, Illinois. And I went there to a meeting some years ago where Howard Zinn was the speaker. Howard has now died. And he says that Washington and Jefferson are kin to the devil. and he's a communist, and he's written the textbook that is the most popular across the country that teaching our kids. I'm a member of the Chicago Presbytery. This is the parent body for all the Presbyterian churches in the Chicago area, and they've completed a study on racism. And they start out by saying that Washington, Jefferson, all these people were racist. They're bad people. And that our big companies were founded by racists. And so our churches are plagued with racism. And so this is past the presbytery, and all the churches are now supposed to be dealing with this terrible racism because of Washington and so on. Help me. What can you say to this?
Well, I think it's important to look at, the founding fathers in terms of the slavery issue and all of that. And I think Washington is a very important figure in that. Yes, he was a slave owner, but there was he grew up as a slave owner. He owned slaves even before he was, had the ability as a kid. This was what he grew up in. What is remarkable about Washington, and what I feel makes him the only person who is deserving of the title the father of our country, is that it was his experience in 8 years as commander of the Continental Army. He changed. He recognized that it was much more than Virginia. The New Englanders he didn't like when he first arrived in Massachusetts became his most trusted soldiers by the time it came to the march to Yorktown. Through Lafayette, who was an abolitionist, he began to recognize the evil of slavery. There were two people inhabiting him, and yet his life was completely interwoven in that institution. And during the war, he wanted, as he said, he wanted to get rid of the institution, but many of his slaves were owned by his wife Martha, which made it illegal for him to do anything. So he was embedded in all that. What's remarkable about Washington, I think you've got to look at people's ability to learn and to change and to see things as they are. And there is no one like Washington where you see that arc in which finally, on his deathbed, he is dying of a throat infection in which he is basically being strangled to death. I mean, just a horrible way to go. He had just recently drafted a new will in which he freed his slaves. And, there he is on the bed, and he asks Martha to bring the two drafts of his will. He has her destroy the old one to keep the other one. And this is his dying act, which established a precedent that was clearly seen. I think you have to put people in the time frame in which they lived. My book about the whale ship Essex, I've had readers who say, I could not have any sympathy for a whaler because they killed whales. And my response to that is, if you grew up on Nantucket in the 19th century, you would have, if you had been a boy, you would have been a whaler, and if you had been a woman, you would have been economically dependent on it. It's the context. You've got to see that, and it's really not fair to the past, and it's not fair to America. I think ultimately you have to look at this country as we are now, and what's great about America is we were born in a revolution, and we will always be in the midst of a revolution as each generation redefines the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in terms of its own time. It's messy, it's disruptive, it's not terribly efficient, but it's what keeps us a free nation. And we're an aspirational people. We are always trying to be better. And that is the essence of America. And we wouldn't have this country if it hadn't been for George Washington. I'm now working on a kind of different kind of book. I've spent the last 2 years, my wife and I and our dog Dora, had been following Washington's travels as president. When he became president, he realized, I'm the head of 13 independent states. What do I do to create a sense of solidarity? He went on a road trip, and he didn't do it in Air Force One. He got into a carriage. He had, 2 secretaries and 6 servants, 2 of them enslaved. And the first trip was, New York was the temporary capital. They went, they went to 60 different towns in New England. Just little towns. He made the decision that he was not going to stay in private homes because that would be playing favorites. He stayed in taverns. Taverns in 1789 were the, flea-bitten Motel 6s of his day. And that's what he did. And it took him a month to do this. He went to every town, and people who were naysayers, and believe me, there were naysayers, saw his commitment to the concept of the government, and he created that solidarity. The longest tour would be 3 months down to the South. He was a Southerner, but he had barely been to North Carolina, never south of that. Went all the way down to Savannah, to Augusta, and back in. And so we have been following him by car, and we just cannot believe the stamina of this guy, the commitment of this guy. Washington slept here is kind of a historical joke. It's not a joke. I mean, the amount of work, he slept in 283 different places before the end of the Revolution, and then he did this kind. The guy was out there, trying to make America work. And we would not have the freedoms we have today, we would not have the ability to have these kinds of conversations if it hadn't been for George Washington.
Well, now I have 2 questions. Are you going to include, probably in one of those road trips of his, he visited 2 synagogues and spoke to 2 Jewish communities?
Yeah.
So you should include that in that.
Oh, yeah. No, it's great. So he did the New England tour, but Rhode Island, and I went to college in Rhode Island, and, Rhode Islanders are Rhode Islanders. And with Roger Williams, the independent man, and they hadn't ratified the Constitution by the time Washington went on his New England tour. So he very carefully took, there are 3 ways to get north from New Haven. You could take where I-95 goes along the coast, which would go through Rhode Island, or you could go the inland route to Hartford, Springfield, and then to Boston. He went inland and never went to Rhode Island. That put a lot of pressure on the state, and that was absolutely his intention. And so within a few months' time, they ratified the Constitution. That summer in 1790, and this is when all sorts of stuff is happening in his government. Jefferson has just become his Secretary of State. He and Hamilton are, their uneasy relationship is beginning. They're trying to work out the compromises that will, create a tax structure and all that. And Washington decides it's time to visit Rhode Island. So he and Thomas Jefferson get on one of John Brown's packets and sail to Newport. And there he got a letter from a member of the Jewish congregation in Newport, one of the oldest. There's a little argument who's the oldest, whether New York or Newport, but this one was really old. And Washington's response, which Jefferson may have had a hand in it because religious freedom was a big part of where Jefferson came from, and which it is still looked to today as one of the most eloquent expressions of the importance of religious freedom ever written. And it was during this trip. And so my wife and I sailed to Newport to do this, and had just the most fantastic tour of the synagogue. And this is a living history. It's not a statue or a museum exhibit with dust gathering around it. By going there, Washington created a ripple effect, which these communities are still feeling. And in a way, all history is local. Tip O'Neill used to say that about politics. And that's what's been really fun following Washington on this, is I've contacted archivists, librarians at all of these towns, and looking for records of the citizens' responses to Washington's. And just about every one of these towns has a plaque somewhere. And then somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, someone's great-grandmother, who was about 90, had a memory of when Washington came to town.
So my first question was, how is Admiral de Grasse remembered in French history?
Yeah, well, Admiral de Grasse, great hero from our perspective. Unfortunately, and Washington and Rochambeau both complained about it. De Grasse was a good admiral, but very impulsive and did not always have the best judgment. And he was lucky. He went up against a very, very mediocre British admiral. It was nobody's first choice to be meeting de Grasse in this. A few months later, de Grasse goes up against one of Britain's great admirals, Admiral Rodney, in the West Indies. It's known as the Battle of the Saints. And de Grasse's fleet would get completely routed by Rodney. De Grasse had the biggest flagship in all of the navies anywhere. He would be forced to surrender his sword to Rodney. It was just absolutely humiliating. He would be a prisoner in London for a number of months, and it was a huge embarrassment to France. And so he is not remembered fondly. But the one thing that was good about that, from my standpoint as a historian, was that there were court-martial proceedings following that great defeat. And as a consequence, the logbooks of many of the captains that were at the Battle of the Chesapeake were preserved and are still at the archives in Paris. And they were an absolute treasure trove for me when it came to recreating the Battle of the Chesapeake, because it's past accounts lean very heavily on English accounts, I think largely because they're in English. The fact is, the French won, and their accounts, and boy, there's a lot of them. And so I found and I'm a sailor. I grew up sailing, racing those great, magnificent yachts known as Sunfish. And I am a Sunfish North American champion. It's no laughing matter. But as a sailor, it was so exciting to read these logbooks, and I worked with a translator in Quebec who helped me with this, to read these accounts of this battle. It's just a fascinating slugfest, and for me as a historian, that's the juice. You're getting those sources that haven't been used, those primary sources that speak to you as if they were speaking to you today.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Several years ago, Dr. D. James Kennedy in Florida spoke about George Washington, and he said that in modern times it's been popular to denigrate or downplay the importance of his Christian faith in his life and in his decisions. Could you? And he went through quite a teaching on showing the importance of his Christian faith. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah. Washington's faith is a fascinating thing. I think and it really ties into his role as a battlefield commander too. When he was experienced his early on, when he was representing Britain in the French and Indian War, he was there at Braddock's Defeat, where every officer on horseback was killed or wounded except for him. And he had 3 bullet holes through his uniform, 1 through his hat, and his best friend and doctor, Dr. Craik, who would actually be there by his bedside when he died, talked to several Indian warriors that were there and told him how everyone was aiming at George Washington and couldn't believe they didn't kill him. And they gave him a name of the person who cannot be killed, or words to that effect. And I think that gave him a profoundly spiritual sense of mission. You can see it in his letters after that. He worshipped in the Church of England, which became complicated after the Revolution, because you then had the founding of Episcopalian faith, and that was a rough transition. And it's interesting, after the Revolution, he would cease taking communion. He would attend church every Sunday, but no one knows quite what was had presiding over that many men killed. What was he thinking about slavery? Who knows what it was? Or maybe he was just angry at what was happening in terms of the new Episcopalian Church. Who knows? But spirituality was absolutely important to him. It's his letters, his whole demeanor was highly spiritual. But I think also ultimately with Washington, who was an intensely private man for someone so public, it was ultimately, his own thing. And from my mind, I think that I have all the more respect for him because of that. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.